Hello, my friends. I wanted to take a moment and make a video that's not really related to the normal philosophical analysis I do of games and anime, and just talk about a phenomenon I've seen among philosophers in general. So if you're here for the normal nerd stuff, just know it's not here. But there is an interesting phenomenon of philosopher novelists who begin their arguments of their point of view with a blanket disparaging of philosophy and its historical tradition wholesale. The statement always tends to run along a general theme of everyone before me is wrong, unsuccessful, and crazy to have wasted their time doing what everyone else was doing. But me, have finally found the answer that will solve every one of their ignorant problems. We saw this in people like Rond and Wittgenstein and Husserl and Heidegger, and what prompts me to be writing this was listening to an interview with R. Scott Baker on the Stuff to Blow Your Mind podcast, discussing a paper he wrote called On Alien Philosophy. It was a very charitable interview, and the interviewer was a fan of Baker's fiction, and asked questions that mostly sought for Baker to explain his ideas in a more detailed way. However, the closest that he got to a question that I would consider a challenge or critique was itself basic hermeneutical bias. Baker had just finished describing how all philosophers previous to himself as being insane, so the interviewer asked, should we then just only do science and give up philosophy? Now, any person who would answer yes to that question has an extremely uninformed opinion about themselves and the human mind. There is always a philosophical bias that influences and directs the course of scientific inquiry and research. Rather intelligently, Baker answered that there is good philosophy. Had he not answered that way, it would have been an argumentative misstep, because he would have then dismissed his own philosophy, along with his dismissal of all other philosophy that he just made. So let's take a moment to evaluate some reasons one philosopher may wish to dismiss all others, and the destructive impact that this can have on a discourse. First, doing so means that the philosopher no longer needs to prove himself or herself to the philosophical community, or prove their own skill in logical reasoning to their readers at large. In philosophy as a practice of academia, you prove your ability to present argument and use logical and analytical reasoning by your ability to accurately reproduce the thinking of your philosophical predecessors. At universities, this is tested more directly as you prepare to move up to critiquing those philosophers, and then presenting your own ideas. Of course, students are tested and trained in all of these in a non-linear fashion, but they are important steps. The philosophy degrees are shorthands that tell us a person has at least proven their skill, if not their actual argument, ideally. When a philosopher takes the approach of disparaging all other philosophies, or also the approach of writing popular fiction to make the argument, a writer may skip the step of proving their skill. In fact, more than just that, they may also reset the expectation of the reader to measure the idea of skill based on how much a person agrees with the ideas the philosopher has expressed in the writing. Because, after all, we have just disparaged the idea that anyone other than the current philosopher in question had any correct idea or skill at all. Doing this disparaging gives yourself a free pass, and tells convinced charitable readers to consider this starting point as the new perfect norm. This disparaging allows the philosopher to redefine logical reasoning and analytical reasoning as agreements with themselves. Second, disparaging all philosophers that come before you allows you to dismiss any critique of your argument by the philosophical community in an ad hominem sense. Just as one does in scientific, sociological, or psychological studies, a published philosophical work is released and begins the process of being critiqued by other professionals. Any empirical claims are cross-checked by available data, and new experiments are designed and conducted. In philosophy, symbolic logic specialists evaluate your structure and how you presented your idea mathematically. Other philosophers expose unstated assumptions and try to evaluate if your premises do deductively or inductively lead to your conclusions. And the philosopher themselves is expected to get into a dialogue with other professionals who do not treat the philosopher with charity, but with skepticism and scrutiny. In other words, any released idea is put to the test, and the test is the dialectic. When you disparage the idea of philosophers prior to you as a hegemon or a monolith, you immediately dismiss any person who may critique you, because they are the members of the old philosophical ilk. My idea is the new logic. My idea is the new rationality. You, old philosophers, are wrong by virtue of having the old heuristics. Your critiques of me cannot be right, because you are not conducting my ascended heuristics. It is painful for someone like me to even write such pretentious words, and yet this is the most honest verbiage of this statement, no matter how charismatically spoken. And I hear so many current philosophers take on this attitude. What does the disparaging do for the writer at this point? Dismissing the critiques directed at themselves, as a person presenting the argument, is not the purpose. What it does is give the charitable reader words to weaponize against any party that would attempt to take them off the bandwagon. The supporters may dismiss the critics through an ad hominem sentence, unnecessary for the idea being argued for. Thus, the philosopher in question may protect his ad hominem disparaging of other philosophers behind a wall of popular fallacy. Is this not how one forms a cult rather than how one has a conversation? This may create for you a career, but probably not that virtue you sought when you first started into the dialectic as a young philosopher. Perhaps this is also why people who choose this tact present their work in fiction first. Building the defense of charitable readers who migrate to the formal philosophical work may be inherent in how this form of thinking attempts to be given presence in the dialogue. Of course, I do not mean to say that all people who take to fiction for philosophy have this attitude, but many who have the attitude take to fiction for philosophy. The next two results are effects that primarily aim at the philosopher themselves and the longevity of their work. Third, the disparaging of philosophers prior leads to the crippling of philosophical growth. When a philosophy takes on the condition that it may never be critiqued by other philosophers, and that agreement with the philosophy determines the new correct form of logical or analytical reasoning as skill sets, the only possible authority on the idea or on thought itself is the principal philosopher themselves. This means that while the person is alive, the charitable readers of the philosopher will seek greater and more detailed expressions of the maximum depth attainable. This means that while the person is alive, the charitable readers of the philosopher will seek greater and more detailed expressions of the idea expressed unceasingly. The philosopher then, in pursuit of growing the mind share among his charitable readers, answers these questions to the best of their ability in the moment. The philosopher may not adjust anything they have stated before, because they have already established the idea as being non-critiquable. The philosopher is thus guaranteed to merely add upon the original idea with ideas that are not inherent to or incongruous to the original idea. What is the difference between depth and complexity? I defer to the extra credits team. Depth is the number of emergent, experiential, different possibilities that come out of one rule set. In philosophy, a rule set may be considered any given philosophical system or argument for a proposed idea. Depth is the ability of the thinker to use the rule set to create meaningful decisions in active scenarios. Complexity, on the other hand, is the mental burden a rule set places on a thinker. It is the amount of data the thinker must manage to use any degree of the rule set's depth. The ultimate goal of a rule set is to have the minimum possible complexity to reach the maximum depth attainable. As complexity increases, the depth becomes more and more unavailable to the thinker, and thus its existence as a rule set is further negated by inaccessibility. Depth multiplied by complexity equals complication. Why did I stop to explain the relationship between depth and complexity? Well, when the philosopher establishes their rule set as infallible and non-critiquable, followed by the inevitable additions the philosopher will make by answering their charitable readers, they will inevitably add more complexity to their rule set while maintaining the same amount of depth. In other words, the philosophy becomes more complicated and less useful or meaningful. After the philosopher dies, their idea will become a void unto itself, where the only option is fighting between charitable readers and everyone else. Fourth, the success gained under this line of disparagement will ultimately be dismissed by another philosopher who uses this disparagement as a tactic. By isolating the idea in the ways discussed above, the philosopher isolates their ability to stay relevant to outgroups. Eventually, another philosopher who takes the same tact to bolster their own new original standard for all thought that dismisses all prior philosophers will come along. When this occurs, just as our original philosopher set out to do, this new philosopher will disparage and dismiss the idea without the need to prove that they have the skill to understand it, without allowing any critique from a lens of that perspective, and infinitely growing additions to their rule set to make it complex enough to account for all possible questions, thus re-establishing a cycle of eventually dismissing itself by reaffirming the momentary effectiveness of using this tactic. The ultimate result may be a few decades of measured success, but eventually a complete dismissal. By attempting to distinguish your idea to the point that it should be treated as separate from the dialectic, you will create an isolated pocket for yourself that will eventually fade into obscurity and be discarded. My suggestion, rather than attempting to distinguish your idea by establishing an exclusionist sentiment to envelop it, present your idea as something that desperately begs for the critique of others and the growth that can be gained therein. Your first publishing of an idea should never be the final draft. Thank you for listening, everyone. I know this is probably not your cup of tea if you're a subscriber to this channel, but I do like to get out an idea of my own every now and again. If you did enjoy this, please like, share with your friends. I guess thank you again. Thank you for listening to this weird one. And as always, stay true.